And we're live.
This is Plant Daddy Podcast. I'm Matthew.
And I'm Steven. So it's felt like we've had a few plants like this lately, plants that we all know, classics, where the episode itself isn't about introducing an exciting plant to each other or listeners so much. It may not even be so much about care because it's so straightforward.
Yeah, the India rubber fig was like that. And these are the houseplants that we just put on the file of this will likely thrive for anyone, anywhere, of any experience level. But that doesn't mean that we won't still try to find some tips and pointers to suggest for their care and maintenance.
Right.
Maybe an interesting backstory.
Yeah, we'll cover care, of course, but we tried to go a bit deeper in some ways with this one. We hope we have a few surprises for you. I'll also put it out there, though, is no news good news? Maybe.
It depends on what you want out of your leafy companions, I guess.
Yeah. This week's episode is brought to you by Southside Plants. They're offering our listeners 25% off on their catalog of products with discount code PlantDaddySummer.
We're both plant parents who love to experiment, try new things to help make our houseplants thrive and look their best, and we know our listeners are too. So the Southside Plants product that I've used the most so far are their houseplant cleaning wipes. They're gentle wipes made out of sustainable materials that remove dust and grime and make your plants less of a home for unwanted pests.
Yeah, and just because I don't grow as many huge broadleaf tropicals as you doesn't mean I don't use these. They're 100% biodegradable. They're thick enough that the same one can be used on many leaves.
Yeah, I use them on all the plants that I used to drag into the shower to spray down periodically, but because the wipes are so much easier, I'm finding that my plants are looking more consistently great because I take care of this task much more regularly when it's this convenient.
Yeah, so far I've used these on my Rhaphidophora tetrasperma, my Raven ZZ plant, and my lipstick plants, and the difference is dramatic. The leaves are basically gleaming, and I'm wondering why I didn't do this more often.
Right, if I'm really going to town and cleaning a bunch of plants and the wipes start to dry out, or if I know the pests have been an issue on this particular plant, I'll just re-moisten the wipe as I go with a little spritz of an insecticidal soap or neem oil spray.
And then they just go right into the same little bin with the dead leaves and trimmed plant bits for composting.
Exactly.
Use the code PlantDaddySummer for 25% off at SouthsidePlants.com, where you can also find tons of tutorials on their assortment of products. We'll have a link on our website too.
And don't forget to check out the before and after photos on Instagram at Southside_plants.
Okay, what is spider plant? Why is it interesting?
Well, it is also known as spider ivy, ribbon plant, and it's one of the plants that has the moniker of hen and chicks, but Chlorophytum comosum is native to tropical and southern Africa and is a really, really classic houseplant.
Right, I think we've all seen this one, but we'll describe it anyway.
Always.
Yeah, it has slender, grassy leaves. It can grow up to 2 feet tall. In North America, it's most often seen in hanging pots, probably because of the long flower stalks that produce little white flowers and the little plantlets that we all know and love at the tips of those floral shoots. And over time, that creates the quintessential bushy, cascading spider plant effect. These sprays, the curtains of baby plants hanging down, they're kind of elegant around that mother plant.
Yeah, and you might see these called stolons, but actually they're called scapes. This is a different kind of way that a new little baby plant is produced than some of the ones that grow little like rhizomaceous offsets.
Okay.
So the variegated forms are the most common ones in cultivation. Variegatum has darker green leaves with a white leaf margin, and the floral shoots are green. And this is overall a smaller plant than Vitatum, which has lighter green foliage and broad white stripes down the center. The scapes of these happen to be white. Then there's also a curly form of this cultivar that is more compact overall, but both of these variegated forms have gained the Royal Horticulture Society's Award of Garden Merit, which, as we were preparing this episode, we were just joking between each other, like assuming that this plant had that since it is such a classic, but we had no knowledge of that until we actually confirmed it.
Again, our favorite award because that climate is so close to ours here in the Pacific Northwest, so it's actually useful for us. I found it interesting too that the simple green variety is said to be the hardest to find.
It is.
I did find some plants for sale online, but not too many. And I don't recall ever seeing a green one in person. Have you, Matthew?
Oh, yeah. So this one's called the Hawaiian spider plant, and
Okay.
it's the same species, but the leaves are just all green. I have seen this this one for sale in person. It just looks like a really tender grass.
Okay.
This won't surprise anyone. It's the one that I prefer to grow.
Shocking.
Yeah, I've seen it fairly often, but it is nowhere near as common as the variegated forms. So, two interesting things about this plant that aren't just readily apparent to glance at it, but I thought were fun enough to include in the Why Is It Interesting. These are not epiphytes in the wild.
Yeah.
It's a terrestrial plant, and you usually see them grown ornamentally in a way that just shows off how beautifully the flowerscapes and plantlets hang and trail. They look like they could be epiphytes grown this way.
Yeah.
But because they grow in the dirt like a ground-dwelling terrestrial plant, they'll form colonies because as the flowers fade, the baby plants begin to form on the ends of the scapes. They'll just bend down under the weight and then root into the soil to propagate themselves.
Yeah, bringing us to the other interesting piece. Their roots are, to me, shockingly thick, fleshy, white.
Yeah.
They have really significant root systems. I was watching some videos of people unpotting massive ones. And really, like, these lush plants, they make it seem like they're root bound. There's so much root in there. But yeah, it's interesting. It's not what you might think from the part of the plant that's exposed.
Yeah, they kind of look like daikon radishes almost.
Kind of do, yeah.
Yeah.
They do look slightly delicious.
This plant is edible, supposedly.
Yeah, actually, I saw such mixed things on that. But yeah, most sources said it's edible. Some articles really said that it wasn't, though. Like, strongly cautioning. It was...
Maybe don't eat it. But
it's a minefield out there.
It's
yeah.
fine for your cats, at least I saw.
Yeah, and of course, we would not leave out its most interesting feature is it's nearly indestructible. I think what most of us think when we think about this plant is the extreme tolerance to low light, inconsistent watering, inconsistent drainage. It tolerates essentially any humidity level. That brings us to... what are the ideal growing conditions, Matthew?
Well, these are prized for being as graceful as they are extremely adaptable, hardy, and easy to grow. Just like you said, they will basically tolerate and even thrive in vastly varied conditions, and they're also susceptible to very few problems.
Right. If we ignore those millions of plants sitting in windowless bathrooms for just a moment, what do they prefer?
Yeah, those bathroom plants with no light, they're going to die. But you might get a good go of it with a spider plant. They do, however, prefer bright, indirect light in a well-draining, fertile substrate, and then a watering routine that allows them to dry slightly once they've been thoroughly soaked from time to time.
Okay, and I was fairly sure you'd say these things. I was a little less sure than I was for some of the other really common species that, I haven't grown lately that we've covered, if I'm totally honest. Just because these are so indestructible, I thought there might be something out of left field like that they actually prefer, but okay.
Yeah, now, one thing that I did read is that they are not fans of excessive heat, which, if you're thinking like a tropical to southern African plant, that might be a little bit counterintuitive, but they often grow in forests. So keeping them on the cooler side is going to keep them the happiest, but, standard indoor conditions are totally what you should be aiming for. They also respond well to trimming because brown leaf tips are one of the most significant issues that you might regularly encounter. And older plants might end up looking a little bit tattered, especially on their oldest foliage. Plus, the scapes don't last forever, especially if you keep them on the dry side, I have found.
Right.
So removing damaged and brown foliage as you see fit is a good thing to do just for their overall aesthetics. And this could include cutting them all the way back down to the soil because those thick, fleshy, daikon-like roots are going to sprout new growth. And then your plant is just going to become full and lush again within a few months as though nothing ever happened.
Okay, and I read that this is likely caused by mineral buildup at the ends of leaves.
Oh, well, the brown tips specifically, yeah.
Yeah, growers say this can be avoided by using purified water or rainwater and milder or diluted fertilizers. Have you tried any of these things, though, or have you just trimmed, like you said?
Well, we actually have pretty solid water quality here in Seattle, so it's not as much of a problem for me, and I'm also pretty scant on my fertilizing to begin with. So I've not really noticed this as an issue, but it's a monocot. Like a lot of these plants that are monocotyledonous that have all of their veins like terminating in the tip of a leaf, like that's where the salts and things will accumulate. So common problem. We've talked about it with Dracaena. We've talked about it with several other plants. It's just kind of par for the course, but I would just prune the tips back if it's fairly minimal. Otherwise, you can always do that thing where you like soak the substrate thoroughly, let it sit for a little while, and then flush it out with fresh water to help to reduce some of that mineral buildup.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, like we've said before, they also have these really substantial root systems that might make you think like, oh my God, I should have repotted this a month ago or 5 months ago. It's so overgrown. But they kind of prefer to be slightly root bound. Like, it's not going to bother them too much. And I read that it's recommended to actually only repot them as the roots become visible, which I've never had happen on a plant that I've grown. That must be pretty insane. They also note that you can repot when watering becomes a challenge. I imagine that means that the plant has filled the pot so much that you can't water it. I have a peace lily that's like that, and it uses its water very rapidly because it is so packed in there. That is probably a sign to repot your spider plant if it's going through its water too rapidly, and just, get it up into a larger pot with some fresh soil. But don't worry too much about the pot boundedness of their root system, because that is just what they're going to do. Now, they're also going to need to achieve a mature size before they're going to freely bloom and produce those plantlets.
Okay.
So don't stress if your young plant doesn't have these yet. You can often find them in relatively small sizes, like 4-inch pots. These are just going to need to develop a strong root system. So if they're in ideal conditions, or even like borderline acceptable conditions, you'll probably end up having some scapes emerging with some of the first baby plantlets within a few months of getting one.
Okay, right. And we're talking about, more ideal conditions. Of course, these will tolerate all sorts of things, as we said.
Yeah.
What have our approaches been for this plant? How successful have they been? Surprise, I'll get it right out of the way. I haven't grown this one since college at least, and this was so far back into my plant blind period that I don't really recall if I gave the plants away or they died.
I'm impressed that you even had one at that point.
So am I. Pat in the back to me. But I remember feeling neutral toward this plant at this point, and just bear with me here, which is actually better than most others I had at that time. I remember not liking my large indoor palm because it was always so infested, for example.
Okay.
But not this one. I think it was on a wall. It was not very near a window, and I think it only grew a little bit during the time I had it, but I was satisfied with it. It caused me no stress, and I was like, I have a thing. And, I thought about it like once a month.
And it probably looked decent enough that you didn't feel like it wasn't a failure.
No shame. Yeah, attached to that memory.
Yeah. Well, I've grown this one quite a few times over the past, but it has never been a prioritized plant in my collection. It's oh my gosh, it's so common, it's so ordinary. It really screams the 1970s to me, which I definitely appreciate, but it also just reminds me of being a very young kid and seeing these hanging in macrame hangers in like most of the kitchens that I was ever in the 80s and 90s. Yeah. Now, this was one of the first plants that I propagated because the ease and fun of propagation, like, honestly might account for about 40% of this plant's appeal just right off the top.
Oh, totally. Like, at least 40%. I mean, that's one of the very best features in my mind, too. So how have you cared for yours more currently, I guess, lately?
Well, it's not really a plant that's got much of my focus, but I never worry about the pot, the soil, or really the care routine that I even have for them. For better or worse, they are solidly in like, quote, the decor class of plants in my house, which means that I basically just treat them rather neglectfully by hanging them in poor light and forgetting to water them faithfully because I know that they'll tolerate it. Like, it's not a special plant, but it's a performer. It's one that will do well.
Yeah.
Basically anywhere that you put it within reason. So the first one that I ever grew, I propagated up from a baby plantlet. I got it somewhere as a kid and it did well. I potted it right after it grew some roots in water, and then it literally just existed only with the light that it received from the aquarium that it was put right next to. Like, my first effort with artificial lighting that I didn't even really consider.
Yeah, and I mean, hey, some of those lights are great, that's better than many, you know. I mean, that dark powder room spider plant. I mean, that was a real example from my life. Okay, but
It sounded so specific. I assume that you'd seen it.
oops. Yeah, but you know, some of those aquarium lights too. At that point, they weren't really meant for growing plants. Even probably just like illuminating fish. Impressed by that plant.
Yeah, well, when it actually bloomed for the first time,
Mm-hmm.
I was so excited because, you know, it's a flowering plant, it's an angiosperm, but I'd never really thought of it as a plant that had flowers. And so I was,
Yeah.
you know, kind of in the day of like, I didn't know that this bloomed. And I didn't realize that that was actually the first step in getting the spiders that hang around the base of it. So that was just a really cool thing, like as a fairly young kid, to like do this little experiment, kind of see how it went, and then like see it do the thing that it's known for. So it was a really fun thing. I don't know what happened to that plant, but it was a great first experience with it.
Okay, yeah. I mean, that sounds like that fairly universal positive spider plant experience, like hassle-free, that easy propagation that I think is so great. Did you ever run into any issues or lose any that you just didn't like misplace?
I mean, I think that I've just kind of like lost my interest in any of the ones that I've grown. Like sometimes that just happens where a plant,
which is sort of another good quality, right? Like these will hang on until you truly just lose all interest. Okay, it's not like you're gonna have some misstep or something, really.
You're right, but like there's a limit to the abuse that they'll endure. I would say that the worst treated spider plant that I grew, it was in my apartment in the U District, like right when I was like really substantially getting into plants. Like this was like a huge boom for my plant growing era, and I knew better, but I hung this plant just above the window frame of a north-facing window that also had like a really long ledge of the roof. So this plant got like literally no usable light.
Not even a north-facing window above it. Cruelly teasing it with north-facing light, which around here is not great.
It was in a kitchen, and I was like, I just want something there, and this plant will survive that. And it actually took a really long time, like a surprising amount of time to show that it was suffering. But eventually, I just could not deny that there was substantial dieback of foliage. Most of the scapes were just hanging from like dead tissue, and that plant was ultimately composted. I could have revived it, I imagine, but I just didn't bother. Now, more recent ones that I've grown, I have more often neglected with water instead of light. And I've had a couple of them actually just die back completely to the soil. But like I mentioned a couple minutes ago, that's not the end of the world. I trimmed off all the dead foliage. I started watering them again, and they regrew, just none the worse for it. It does really set back the appearance of a plant to have it die back to the soil, obviously. But yeah, an observation that I find really interesting, though, is that when they get thirsty, they don't immediately wilt in the way that a lot of other really responsive plants do.
They just put on this brave face and
they just smile and they're like, I can endure this. No,
help.
No, actually what happens is the foliage loses the saturation of its green and the leaves become kind of translucent and pale.
We've all seen this, I think.
I mean, I think that most of them kind of look that way sometimes.
Well, maybe.
Pregnant pause. Yeah. Beyond when they just get like translucent and pale, they will droop. But it's better to not let them get to that point, I have found, because that's when you start to see more leaf browning, more dieback of foliage. So I tend to use the leaf coloring as an indicator of when to water in case I've been a little bit neglectful there, because even though they're very resistant against drought, it's going to set you back aesthetically to have a plant that is just like fighting to keep its foliage maintained. And just best practice, water them before the soil is more than halfway dry.
Okay. So have we enjoyed this plant, and would we recommend it? Would we replace it if it died? This part of the episode.
I mean, the spider plants are fine. Like they are, they're ornamental. They are very appealing. They're very inexpensive. There is just a lot to be appreciated about them. But to me, it's fine. It's a very kind of retro throwback appearance. I have this really set association of this plant and macrame plant hangers, which there's nothing wrong with that. But like, sometimes
It's from a certain, era or something, or a certain time in our childhood, or yeah, right?
Yeah, but like I think of snake plants, the Sansevieria trifasciata specifically, as being like a throwback reference kind of to the mid-century, like the 50s kind of look. So I do like a
Hmm.
retro-y plant. It's just that this one I think is very, very specific,
Okay,
and I would
yeah.
absolutely recommend it, but I just don't think that it's going to excite a lot of people unless you need a really good positive experience with one of your first plants. This one will give you
Hmm.
that.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is an excellent plant for new plant parents, just kind of broadly speaking. It's great for spaces that just aren't bright enough, like you've been saying, for other
Hmm.
plants, but where you'd still like to have some growth or some babies to propagate. And I think some of the other plants that you might consider for spots like this, they just wouldn't change, like snake plants or ZZ plants. These might grow.
Well,
Um,
yeah, and I think that it's also worth mentioning that this is one of the easy hanging plants. Like the
yeah,
other ones that you just mentioned, they're like,
exactly.
tabletop floor plants, like plants that are upright in growth. This one's draping
Hmm.
and trailing, so it is unique in that it offers an appearance and a style and an aesthetic vibe that's fairly unique among these like basically indestructible plants.
Right. And I think, another kind of undercurrent in these stories, like this is a great one for kids.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think so often sensitive plant, Mimosa pudica, that's one that we hear is great for plant interested kids. But spider plant could probably teach them more about the whole experience of care, dividing plants, and the stuff beyond, like touching them and they move. I think in a positive way. So maybe it's one to think about too for, like brand new, younger plant parents.
Yeah, I definitely had that experience where I was very intrigued with this plant and it got me thinking more about other ones. And then
Hmm.
I also don't want to, make it sound like an experienced plant person has nothing to gain from having a spider plant in their collection. I'm sure that a lot of people love the spider plants that they grow because they are
Yeah.
indeed so durable and adaptable. They are very beautiful, even in a very specific way that we can all picture in our heads. This is a
Hmm.
plant that could be a cherished plant regardless of how extensive your plant interests are.
Right.
So, are there any final thoughts that we want to just kind of pass on to any plant parents interested in giving this one a try?
Well, I think just go for it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think if there's a single most important care question, if I were to grow one, it's what can we do to keep the greens those deep greens versus sort of the more, yellowed or kind of washed out greens. To me, they look worst when they're that kind of pale color.
Hmm.
You kind of covered this, but just succinctly, what do we do?
Well, I think that you specifically should look for the Hawaiian one because that is a green plant that will stay pretty green. But
Yeah.
if you're feeling like maybe your plant is looking a little anemic, a little bit of nitrogen can help to like make the greens more pronounced. This isn't a plant that's like super, super hungry though. So I don't think that fertilizing is like absolutely necessary, but the light level will help. If you have really bright light, like towards the upper end that they'll tolerate, you'll probably see more variegation. The color will probably be more saturated overall, but this plant's not going to tolerate a lot in the way of direct sunlight. Some morning or some afternoon sun's fine, but if you want less of that variegation, try growing them a little darker and you'll get more of the green developing on the foliage. And I think that other than that, like we've kind of talked about that pale washed out green, those plants are probably by and large fairly dry. So try to keep the
Okay.
watering a little bit more consistent. I feel like my plants are always the most beautiful when I don't let them even come close to fully dry.
Okay.
They're going to be resilient against drought, like we have belabored, but they're also going to tolerate fairly consistent watering. Don't keep their soil completely saturated, but if they always have available water and if they're not grown in like the most scant, meager, nutrient availability,
Hmm.
they're just gonna look good. So there's nothing tricky there.
Okay.
But I think that even as much as we talk about how tolerant they are for low light, you're absolutely going to get the best looking plant that has the most little spiders hanging from it if you've just given it that medium indirect light that the majority of other houseplants are going to thrive in. So
Hmm.
keep in mind that they have that flexibility, but if you want a really handsome plant, just, give it something that's a little bit better than like the bare minimum that it requires to survive.
Okay. All right, historical, botanical, cultural information. Matthew's Botanical Corner is starting, and I have also taken over part of it again, but you start, Matthew.
Well, I have to admit, I'm not very excited about this section this week because this plant just does not have a ton, besides the fact that it's actually been around for quite a while. Like, we found that this plant was grown as early as the 18th century. It was described into science in 1794, and it spent almost a century being shuffled around between other genera before it was finally settled into Chlorophytum in 1862. And then I was reading a little bit about this, but kind of didn't do the whole deep dive because I lost interest a little bit, and I didn't think that anybody listening would care too much. But
Okay.
but it has been confused with similar species in the past. Today, it seems like there are 3 recognized varieties of this species. I couldn't really find that they were like subspecies necessarily, but there are like 3 forms that have slight differences in their form and appearance. They were consolidated into the Comosum umbrella in 2005. This kind of hints at the reported challenges of creating species boundaries within this genus. And I was reading, scant little bits of information about how the evolutionary pathways of these forest-dwelling plants has kind of led to a similar morphology across the genus, particularly with the specific ecosystems that they inhabit. And it seems like the genus is kind of a bit of a mess in terms of like how things are counted, but, that doesn't matter for anybody growing them at home. I did want to hear a little bit more about whether or not this species really is cross-pollinated regularly, because since it's one that is so reliable with asexual propagation, I don't think that the versions that we grow ornamentally at home are that much different from the ones that are found growing in the wild. So I imagine that you could have like a whole field of these that are basically just the same genetic individual. So there's something interesting there. Maybe I should check out Indefensive Plants and see if they have anything to say about this.
Actually, yeah.
But yeah, that's basically the extent of what I wanted to discuss in the Botanical Corner today.
Okay. So for me, this is another one that's so ubiquitous that I was curious how and when it came into the houseplant trade. You mentioned a little bit. I found I think the consensus story. This is another plant that became popular in the West during the Victorian era. Many online sources, but not all, trace it to Carl Peter Thunberg, a Swedish botanist. He collected the first seeds and plants to study when he stopped in South Africa, coming home from a trip to China. He brought them back to Europe, and it spread through Victorian circles from there.
Okay.
This may sound familiar. I feel like this root, this time period, this is kind of what happens.
I'm kind of imagining this plant growing in these like conservatories and sunrooms alongside like Boston ferns and parlor palms and aspidistra.
Yeah, and maybe had we done this episode like 50 episodes ago, maybe this would sound, like a more interesting origin story, right? But I feel like we've used most of these words even, right? It's like maybe Carl's name even, but okay, so that's kind of the consensus origin story for the houseplant trade. I then found an article that tried to trace the origin of the spider plant name, and it suggested another possibly taxonomic reason. The plant was at one time classified in the same genus as a plant in Europe that was traditionally used as a spider bite antidote.
Oh.
That other plant is called Anthericum liliago, if you're curious. And the spider plant we're talking about today is now classified in a different genus, but that vernacular name from the previous association stock.
Oh.
So yeah, kind of an interesting story I found on the Laid Back Gardener blog.
I absolutely would have assumed that it was called spider plant because it just looks spidery.
Me too. And
Right.
and you gotta wonder. I wonder if that's why that was thought to be a spider bite antidote. The plant that looked like it, or it was associated within the same genus. Maybe it's that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, if you think about like people centuries ago.
Yeah.
But otherwise I couldn't really find anything outlandish, bizarre, and I was a bit surprised by that, honestly. Like, I figured someone would be doing something strange with these because there's so many out there.
Yeah.
Or like I would find a $600 so-called cultivar for sale. But yeah, I mean, happy and slightly disappointed to report that I didn't find anything of the sort.
That is a little bit surprising, but this plant doesn't
Yeah.
have, that much going for it besides just being reliable and dependable. So,
Yeah. So how does spider plant compare to the plants, quote, in its class? And, by that I mean like the widely accessible, inexpensive, easy house plants. I think we've had more than a few episodes where we call a plant the easiest or best for beginners. Let's stand in our truth here. How does this compare to those to you?
Yeah, I mean, it is, hand in hand with most of those plants that we have called great for beginners.
Yeah.
Like any of those plants, though, the specific care details are almost an immaterial aspect for growing these successfully.
Right.
If you can literally keep anything else alive in your home growing conditions. But kind of like I hinted at before, I think that maybe there's something a bit pigeonholed about the spider plant that doesn't lend itself to being a massive popular choice for anyone. Like, it's undeniably fun to propagate. It's really cool to watch your plant become thick and full of hanging spiderlets, but there just aren't any surprises with the spider plant, like good or bad.
Okay.
We know what they look like. There's not a lot of variation there. We know how they're displayed. You usually hang them.
Yeah.
They could be put on a shelf. But we've belabored that they're also extremely hardy and reliable. That sort of completes the appeal that these offer. So whether or not that's enough to encourage someone to grow one if they haven't, I don't know. They're great, but maybe it's telling that I have a ton of easy, nearly indestructible houseplants, including many varieties of the same species, just for like the appeal that they offer in different cultivars or different colors, whatever. But I just have one spider plant, and that's enough.
Okay, that is a statement. Okay, if you know anything about Matthew. Yeah, to me, I'm pretty neutral. I have been less than neutral. You've been less than neutral. So neutral is something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. That's not to say that we dislike this plant at all.
Yeah. We would say that.
We have.
But,
said
we don't.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. But to me, right now, I think there's something a bit more interesting, actually, in its form than some of the other easiest classics as I see them.
Yeah.
I know spider plants are everywhere, but I feel like I notice them slightly less than snake plants, ZZ plants, Tradescantia, in a good way.
They're all having a moment right now.
Well, yeah, those have had popular cultivars lately-ish, and have just been in the indoor plant consciousness more than spider plants, I think. So I kind of think that's like a virtue, right?
Yeah, that's actually a good point. I do want to throw out that they're also in the Asparaceae family. I always love to mention when a plant is an Asparaceae.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I think too, like these offer a grassy form. Maybe you touched on this earlier. The others just don't, right? Like there's the upright forms that we get from ZZ and like the snake plant Sansevieras, and we get the trailing Tradescantias, but not this grassy kind of form, right? So
yeah,
I don't know. Maybe it sounds like I'm splitting hairs. I am being serious. Maybe I'm suggesting plant parents consider spider plants if they're shopping for something inexpensive, easy, and yeah, maybe it's like the somewhat more interesting choice at this moment within that group.
That's a really good thing to point out. I think that this plant is so appealing, and it absolutely offers something that's quite different from those other plants that are in that similar category. It grows in a way, and it's displayed in a way that is fairly unique among these plants that I think that anyone could do very, very well with without even trying.
Yeah, I've just seen it slightly less. So, I mean, do it for me, if no one else.
Yeah. So is there anything else that we want to throw in about the chlorophytum?
Okay, one last thing. We both independently found another plant in this genus that could be an interesting alternative to plant parents looking for something a bit different, a bit more unusual, but still related.
Yeah.
Matthew, do you want to talk about Chlorophytum orchidastrum?
Yes. So this is called the mandarin plant. I think that the specific cultivar that we're talking about for orchidastrum is Fireflash. And basically, it looks a lot like a kind of upright, bushy philodendron, like one of those self-heading philodendrons. It also looks a bit like the fairly uncommonly grown peacock gingers, where it is just this like dense rosette of leaves. It's very tender. It has a very similar kind of texture to the like the classic spider plant, but this one has broader leaves. They don't arch and trail kind of the same way, and it doesn't produce the long scapes that then end in little baby plants. I think that this plant is very appealing looking because it also kind of gives me like the colorful Aglaonema vibes. I have read consistently that it's very similar in care. It's a very similar plant in a lot of ways, but it just offers a slightly different appearance to the spider plant that we know. I don't think that you would necessarily like look at it and be like, oh, that's obviously a spider plant relative, but it's very appealing to me.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one to Google. They are for sale. They aren't super common, but they're not, at collector plant prices necessarily either. So it's one to check out. And, hey, if we both like it, how often does that happen?
Yeah, now we almost got away without really describing like what makes it specifically interesting. The petioles are like kind of like this orange sherbet color.
So orange. And I was looking at pictures too. I'm like, okay, is somebody just cranking up the values in these photos? Consensus is that it's pretty orange.
Yeah, so. I think that I found some photos of just wild natural plants that are not the specific cultivar that we grow, the Fireflash cultivar, but it has this really nice, unusual kind of attribute where it's this like very like dessert like orange color down below.
It's really different.
Yeah. Like the canopy of green leaves is appealing, but that's not the star. It's the petioles. So I have seen this plant for sale. I've never actually bought it. And ever since I've thought about growing it, I've not seen it for sale. It's one of those classic cases. I've not rushed out to order one, but if I do see one again in the future, I'll pick one up for both of us so that we can give some thought to this particular one.
All right, great.
All right. Well, is there anything else at all that we want to throw in this week?
Okay, one tiny last thing. There is a song about spider plants, actually for them. We can link to that in our show notes. Just leave you with that tease.
Yeah. So I will, I guess, listen to that when we're done recording.
All right, this has been Plant Daddy Podcast. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell your friends about us. If you enjoy what you've heard, please give us a 5-star rating. That'll help others find us too. If you want to get in touch, email us at plantdaddypodcast@gmail.com or check us out on social media. Just search Plant Daddy Podcast. Till next week, thanks for listening.
And happy growing.